Now, just a little, I don't know if you like this sort of thing, but the monks of the Middle Ages were very into riddles. They love, if you're sitting around all day in a monastery, you get very bored and you're trying to find. So, O come Emmanuel, if you look at all the names for Jesus in Latin, so Emmanuel, Rex, Clavis, it actually, if you write them all down in order, it creates a sentence that in Latin says ero cras, which means tomorrow I will come. And so when you add that whole song together, it gives the promise of Advent, tomorrow I will come, in this sense of preparation. All right, Nick, go ahead and put up our first picture. You'll remember last week I was telling you about introducing you to some of our Japanese words for Advent. I need to tell you, this isn't a Japanese lesson, because I don't speak Japanese. What it is, though, is using some of our characters that are being shared from Hiroshima, our brother church in Hiroshima, to reflect on the meaning of this season. So this was last week, we talked about heiwa, which means peace, and we talked to you about what the pictogram of the kanji means. So that was our first virtue, was peace, and here's the next one. So Nick, let's do the next one. This is hope. So this is the kanji of hope. And kind of like I mentioned to you before, the way that these kanji were designed was there were sort of implicit meaning in the pictures that came together to create one word. So the word for hope in Japanese is kibo. And as we talk about, we have 11 students, 10 or 11 students, going to Japan next summer. So when we talk about this formation and this work, we literally just bought their plane tickets this week. And so the word kibo means hope. And if you look at the top character there, that top character means something scarce, something rare. And so that's something to think about, that oftentimes when we're considering hope, particularly the hope of Advent, we're not hoping for something common and cheap. We're hoping for something that's like a treasure. And of course, this is God. We're hoping for God to be among us. So the scarcity and the rareness of the gift. And underneath that is an interesting, if you look at the one that looks, it's the bottom right, it looks like the letter A with 2 bars across it. That's actually the symbol for the moon. And underneath it, and also for the months, but if underneath it, that symbol was used for human beings a long time ago. So if you look at that bottom symbol, it's very much a picture of someone looking up at the moon. And that's a very poetic prayer in my mind. Someone who's standing in the night, looking up to the sky, offering a prayer for a different world. And that to me captures very much this meaning of hope. So when we look at this kibo character, if you imagine someone standing on the earth, looking up to the only source of light in the night, and they're hoping for the world to be a different place than what it is. They're hoping for a scarce gift. And maybe the world in which we live, that scarce gift might be the gift of heiwa, or the gift of peace. The gift that, in fact, something different might happen among us. Now, of course, that is a poetic image, and I'm sort of a sucker for some of that poetry. There's someone standing there going, I believe the world can be different. It's very cinematic. And of course, the cold-hearted realist will say, there's nobody listening to you. There's nobody to hear your prayer. It's just the moon. It's just the moon reflecting the light of the sun. It's a simple scientific fact that the light of the sun is being reflected off the moon, and you've convinced yourself that there's something there. There's nothing there. This has always been the modern critique of religion. There's nothing there. You're just expressing this because you can't deal with the cold, harsh reality of the world, Or the other critique would be not that there's someone there, but the one who's there is indifferent to us. So maybe there is some sort of divine principle and some cosmic leader, kind of the one that made the watch and set it off, but doesn't really care what happens to human beings. So you can go ahead and cry to the moon, but sorry, God is so far removed from human dealings that your little hope for something different doesn't mean much. Well, of course, that would be a very depressing sermon if that were true. You just go, well, why did we come to church today? That seems kind of dark. Well, this is where the message of Advent is the countermeasure, or the message of Advent is the antidote to a world that feels that there is no possible different future, that there is nothing that we can change about a world that experiences so much conflict, so much hardship, so much violence, so much confusion. And the message of Advent isn't that we're going to change it, because we're not. The message of Advent is God's going to respond to that prayer offered in the night. Because what happens when the moon talks back? This is one of the interesting questions. What happens when a voice talks back, and not just some sort of principle of nature, not a something? What happens when it's a someone that speaks to you? So you say, oh, if only the world could be different, and a voice from heaven goes, yes? And you go, oh, you were listening. Yes, I was listening. And this isn't a voice that's indifferent, and it's not a voice that's malevolent or malignant. It's a voice that cries out in the prophet Isaiah, comfort. Comfort you, my people. We take for granted prophets, but they're really a wonderful invention in the world, and they didn't always exist in the world. There was a prophetic character in the world, but they really start to emerge at the same time that we see major empires begin to be formed, particularly the Assyrians. When modern metallurgy, or pre-modern metallurgy, allowed them to begin spreading out their military and building networks of cities, at the same time we see prophets emerge. It's an interesting historic phenomenon, and it's God sending a voice into the world so that people can hear that God talks back, that God has something to say about how we're living, that God has something to say about history, that God has something to say about humanity. And the message that God has for the people, and the message God has in Advent today, is comfort. Comfort you, my people. Now, of course, this message doesn't mean much if the people are already comfortable. This is a message to people who are feeling totally disillusioned with the possibility that they have any future. These are the generations who have been in Babylonian exile. For almost 2 full generations, they have disappeared from where they lived, from the language they spoke, from the worship they had. All of that is a fading memory. As someone once said, the aroma in an empty bottle. There's nothing left but the smell of what was. These are people who many of them are convinced, many of them don't even speak Hebrew anymore. That's why when they go back, you'll see all these stories in the Bible where they're reading the law of Moses, and then someone has to explain to the people what the law means, because none of them speak that language anymore. They've all been raised in Babylon, according to Babylonian norms and customs. And so they themselves are foreigners to their own tradition. And God doesn't go, well, what's the point? Now we're going to deal with this mess of people. God goes, don't worry about it. Comfort, comfort my people. Even though you're like grass, I am the eternal God. I will make a way for you. I will lift you up. I will bring you home. The exile will end. And this is the message of hope. Hope isn't just humanity crying out in the night for the world to be different. Hope is that scarce gift coming amongst us and bringing life. This is the promise. That's why we see, we're in the Gospel of Mark now. The joke among liturgy people, we have this 3-year cycle, and the 3 years are A, B, and C, and they change the first Sunday in Advent, so we have a new gospel every Advent. And there was a funny meme going around this week of a monk going, oh, I keep writing year A on my checks, because it was the last liturgical year. An obscure joke, but a funny joke, if you're liking liturgy. But we're in the Gospel of Mark. And you'll notice this is chapter 1 and verse 1 of the Gospel of Mark. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, says Mark. You'll notice there's no Christmas story, there's no Mary, there's no Magi, there's no shepherds, there's no David, there's no child Jesus in the temple. The Gospel of Mark starts with the baptism of Jesus. There's none of the childhood memories of Christ. That will only come with Matthew and Luke. But Mark wants us to know the content of what it is that we're doing. He doesn't say, the beginning of the okay news for some of you, the beginning of some decent news, depending on how well you're doing financially, or depending on how many friends you have. He simply says the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. This is what is so fundamental about the Christian message, is that the Christian message is good news. This is what's so fundamental about the meaning even of the Lutheran Reformation, that it is easy for human beings to become convinced that there isn't good news, or you have to make your own news, or you have to find a way to God. That is not the message of this religion, of this faith. The message of this faith is the arrow cross of O come, Emmanuel. It is the message that God will come to us. God will come amongst us. God will be present amongst us. So it says the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, and it introduces John the Baptist, this famous Advent character, in the Judean desert, with honey in his beard and locusts in his teeth. And people say, oh my gosh, he looks like a real religious figure. He's a little bit angry with us. He's cranky. He looks weird. He smells weird. He's a little, that's a religious figure. And they're all convinced that John is going to be the one who's bringing in this good news. Because John fits in the scheme of people who need to get their act together, come down to the river and pray, come get washed up, and then mess up and do it again. That's the baptism of John. And people say, oh my gosh, he must be the Messiah. And John goes, I am not the Messiah. That's why in the Gospel of John, Jesus constantly refers to himself by the name that Moses was given by God, I am. I am the vine, I am the branches, I am the gate. And when people say to John the Baptist, are you the Messiah? John the Baptist says, I am not. He takes that name and he negates it immediately so they know who he's not. I am not that person. And what God is bringing into the world is not a version of John's baptism, which is, look, we all know you mess up, just keep coming back and getting a little bit cleaned up, and we'll just do this endless wash cycle without any change. John says there's somebody coming that when he comes, he's going to bring not just good news, but the best news. And he's going to fundamentally change the game, which is God is going to bring a new spirit and a new heart among the... God is going to take this scarce gift and make it a resource that everyone can access so they can too live into the fullness of this life. And he does it in the midst of a world that it appears to be impossible in. And this is why hope must live in the real world, a world of bombs, a world of drownings, a world of violence, a world of betrayal, a world of whatever you can imagine. Yes, it's all true. A world of gas chambers, a world of slavery, a world of human trafficking, a world of depression, a world of suicide. Everything, name anything, that's the world that this message of hope is coming into. Because Christianity is not avoiding the pain and suffering and reality of the dark night. It's God saying yes to that world that it might be redeemed. As a final note, I preached long last week, so I'm preaching short this week. I think it'll average out. I'll show you this picture as a final thought. Nick, pull up this final picture. You've probably seen this. This is Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem. Now, that rubble is the rubble of the war in Gaza now. And they're not having Christmas in Bethlehem this year because there's a war. So they took the war's rubble and they made their Christmas crèche scene. And it's exactly, this picture is so powerful because you say, in a world of war, in a world of broken concrete, in a world of cluster munitions and secret operations, what is God's answer? God's answer is to put a baby in the rubble. God's answer is to come amongst us as a child in the war. And the fact that God can redeem a world like ours with the gift of a baby is the true meaning and power of hope. Because the baby's going to be born in the rubble, the baby's going to go to a cross, the baby's going to be alone in a grave, and that's when God's going to do his best work. And this is why you must be people of hope and bear this Advent light, because this is how God redeems the world. Amen.